Have you ever wondered how far you can go to the headquarters of someone who had everything tore? I have a story that will mess with your bowels. A report that few know, but that carries as a devastating as silent force. I discovered in the dusty archives of Casa Grande do Engenho Santana, Bahia, documents that reveal a revenge that forever changed the fate of that property. What I found will make you question what we know about resistance. It's not just another lift case. It's much deeper, something that occurred in the shadows, planned with mastery by hands that served the same wines that, on a holy night, turned into a gun. If you enjoy stories that show the other side of our formation as a nation, subscribe to the channel now. Believe me, after knowing the details of what happened at that 1783 Easter dinner, you will never look at the rituals of that time in the same way. Prepare for a journey inside Joaquim's mind, a man who has transformed his privileged position within the manorial house into an instrument of calculated revenge for years. A story that the colonial elite tried to bury, but survived through the whispers between generations. The sun no longer bathes the ruins of what was one of the most prosperous mills of the Bahian Reconcavo. The low vegetation now covers the stone and lime remains of the great Casa do Engenho Santana. In the air there is a smell of wetland, mixed with the sweet odor of the sugarcane that still grows wild in the surroundings. The wind blows between the collapsed walls, producing a lament that seems to echo the voices of those who lived there and died. It was here, in this same terrain where only traces remain, that one of the most elaborate and lethal revenge in Brazilian colonial history unfolded. The year was 1783, and life in the mill followed the relentless pace of sugar, sweet for the few, bitter for many. In the midst of this wicked dynamic, a man knew how to turn his servitude into a weapon, his invisibility into power, his pain in a meticulous plan. There is no shadow without light, no submission without resistance, no oppression without retaliation. This proverb, transmitted in secret among the enslaved of that time, condenses the moral strength that guided Joaquim in his silent and fatal execution. What happened that Easter night reverberates to this day as a reminder that true justice, when denied by the powerful, finds unsuspected ways to speak. As we observe these ruins, it is impossible not to feel the weight of the story they carry. Each fallen stone, each mark on earth has a part of the plot that ended with glasses erected in celebration, then turned into death instruments. Joaquim's case is not just a footnote in the colonial archives. It is a will of the complexity of resistance against slavery. If you want to follow more cases like this, which move with all society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any investigation. The Santana Engenho stood out for fertile land, with about 70 slaves working in its various sections. The large house, built at the highest point of the property, was an imposing two-story construction with 10 bedrooms, 3 rooms, and a porch that surrounded the whole structure, from which Baron Jacome Alves de Figueiredo supervised his domains as a cruel god. Below the big house, in a soft inclination, were the large senzala, an elongated and window-free construction where the workers in the field, and further away, the small senzala, intended for household and slaves, a luxury that just masked a different form of control. Life in the mill began even before the sun appeared on the horizon. At 4 in the morning, the bell hanging next to the moenda sounded, pulling out those bodies already exhausted from sleep. For those who worked in the sugarcane field, the journey stretched for 18 hours, under the sunny sun of Bahia, cutting sugarcane with poorly sharp bars, carrying heavy beams, feeding the flip furnace. Flor Geronimo, a low sapola, marked man, always carried a whip of braided leather with small pieces of metal at the tip. It was known for using this instrument without the need for provocation. It was enough that the pace of the work would decrease minimally, so that the crack cut the air, followed by the scream of pain of the chosen victim. At Casa Grande, work started equally early, but stretched into the night. Kitchen slaves prepared the breakdown of the manor family as the mukamas arranged the rooms and helped their ladies with the complicated dresses and hairstyles. The pajans ran to answer any call, and the main cope, Joaquim, supervised the cleanliness of the silver and crystals, prepared the drinks, and served at the table. During the night, the sound of forbidden drums, occasionally the silence broke, quickly suffocated by the intervention of the bush captains surrounding the property. In the senzalas, the smell of sweat and blood mingled with the aroma of the medicinal herbs that the elders secretly cultivated to treat the wounds left by work and punishments. In the air there was something beyond the sweet odor of sugar cane and molasses, a feeling, a growing tension that thickened with each new whip, with each new humiliation, with each new child torn from his mother's arms to be sold. Something was about to break that perverse balance, and the instrument of this rupture was the least suspicious of all. Joaquim was not like the others. Among all the enslaved of the Santana Ingenio, he occupied a unique position, carrying in himself the paradox of his condition. Born on the property, the son of a domestic slave with a free man who temporarily worked on the plantation, Joaquim grew up in the back of the big house, traveling between two worlds that rarely touched. At 12, his intelligence and discretion caught the attention of the Baroness, who decided to train him as a cope. Joaquim learned quickly not only to serve at the table with elegance, but also to distinguish the Portuguese wines from the French only by aroma, to polish the silly until it reflected as a mirror, and to remain absolutely invisible while it was present, an attentive ghost that served without being noticed. For 23 years, Joaquim served the Figueiredo family with a competence that guaranteed him the rare privilege of freely moving between Casa Grande and the nearby village, where he would seek special orders for baron banquets. This transit allowed it to establish a network of contacts and knowledge that no other enslaved property had. Joaquim has angel hands, the Baroness said to her visits, when the Jaller served the wine without spilling a drop, even in the thinner cups of crystal, and eagle eyes, the Baron added, referring to Joaquim's ability to realize when a glass needed to be replenished even before the guest noted. This confidence deposited in his skills granted Joaquim access to the most private spaces of the manorial family. He was present in the intimate conversations, in trade agreements, in the whispered confidences. He heard everything, memorized everything, processed everything, without anyone suspecting that behind those low eyes and impassive face worked a sharp mind as a razor. In the rare hours of rest, Joaquim was with Father Adam, an old African who lived in the fringes of the property, in a small cabin away from the main senzala. It was from him that Joaquim learned about the plants of the region, which heal, which relieve the pain, and which, in precise doses, could kill without leaving apparent traces. "Knowledge is power," he whispered Father Adam, "but power without purpose is wind that passes without a mark." And Joaquim kept these words, along with every information he collected in his traffic between worlds, every secret he discovered in the dark corners of the big house, every plant he learned to identify in the woods around the mill. Leave in the comments, never give up the truth if you believe justice must reach all the oppressed. The horror in the Santana mill was not an isolated event, but a meticulously constructed system that intensified over the years. As sugar production increased and the Baron's fortune grew, cruelty also expanded to the same measure. It all started with more frequent punishment. The Jerome Flor, realizing that he could please his lord by increasing productivity at any cost, introduced the double trunk, a modification of the traditional torture instrument that allowed to arrest 4 people simultaneously. The whip, previously limited to 25 whip, reached 50, leaving back in alive flesh. Then came the night punishment. Slaved slaves accused of more serious infractions were taken to a removed shed from where his screams could not be heard by the manor family. There, in addition to the whip, was applied to the graiest, salt to the open wounds, and the torment of the Flanders mask, a metal instrument that covered the face and prevented proper nutrition. In the month preceding Easter 1783, an unexpected drought affected the region, and the Baron, fearing damage, further intensified the pressure on workers. It was during this time that Joaquim witnessed, serving wine during a dinner with other planters, the Baron boast of a new punishment method. "I found the solution to the lazy," he said among Portuguese wine sips. "I send the black man to a tree trunk near a tingling, covered only with molasses. The ants do the rest, and the next day he works with twice the speed." The guests laughed and toasted to the host's ingenuity, while Joaquim, impassive, filled the glasses. His eyes, however, recorded every face, every laugh, every toast to the torture he witnesses the next morning. The chosen victim was Sebastião, a young man of 17 newly arrived from another mill. Accused of breaking a tool, he was subjected to punishment, just as the Baron had described. Joachim, sent to verify the state of the punished morning, found only a swollen body covered with wounds, his open eyes fixed in the sky, his mouth in a last silent scream. When he reported death to the Baron, he just shrugged. One piece less. Maybe it had exaggerated in the molasses. And turning to his wife, he added, "Honey, we need to order 3 more young slaves in the next shipment. This lot is proving to be too fragile." It was at that moment, observing the absolute indifference to life that had erased, that something was definitely broken within Joachim. His face remained impassive, his hands firm as he served breakfast, but his soul turned the pain into fuel for what he would come. The 1783 winter in the Bayan Recôncavo was marked by heavy rains that soaked the sugarcane fields and threatened the crop. In the Santana Ingenio, the tension was palpable while the Baron pressured the overseer to extract more work from the already slave-exhausted. It was in this climate of amplified oppression that fate struck the coup that would transform Joachim's contained pain into an irreversible plain. Maria de Rosario, Joachim's younger sister, worked at Casa Grande as mucama of Baron's younger daughter. At the age of 19, he had a beauty that was not unnoticed, and that, to his disgrace, attracted the attention of the oldest son of the Lord of Ingenio, Afonso, newly ruled from his studies in Coimbra. On a February afternoon, while the family was in the chapel participating in a novena, Afonso ordered Maria do Rosario to go to the library to pack the books he had scattered. There he locked the door, and ignoring the girl's supplications, raped it brutally. Joachim, returning from a trip to the village where he had fetched wine for the cellar, found his sister hidden at the back of the kitchen, the swollen face of crying, the evident marks of violence in his body. In whispers interspersed with sobs, she told the incident. That night, while cherishing Maria do Rosario on her treadmill in the domestic senzala, Joachim noticed a change in her sister's breath. A stutter took over his chest, his eyes widened in silent panic, and before he could call for help, she went, victim of internal bleeding resulting from the violence suffered. The funeral ritual had to be performed on the hidden. Maria do Rosario's body was washed with herbs by 3 older women in the senzala. Joachim cut a strand of his sister's hair and tied it with a piece of white cloth, keeping it by the chest. Then they dug a shallow grave by the river that cut the property, away from the eyes of the big house. While the earth covered the sister's body, Joachim took a silent oath. There were no words said aloud, just a sealed promise between him and the ancestors who now received Maria do Rosario, a promise marked by the touch of the river water on his lips, by the earth in his hands, by the wind that dried the tears that allowed itself to spill for the last time. The next morning, when he served the Baron and his family breakfast, his face was as impassive as he always, his hands as firm as before serving coffee. Only his eyes, if someone paid attention, carried a new quality, a fixed and distant glow, like that of a knife stored in the sheath, waiting for the right time to be landed. The Santana mill was a microcosm of the colonial system, where each figure represented a gear in the machinery of oppression. At the top, Baron Jacome, whose cruelty was masked by a European education and polished ways that reserved exclusively for his equals. Beside her, the Baroness Leonore, who outsourced her violence through orders whispered to the households, never dirtying her own hands but being equally responsible for the suffering she caused. Below them, a hierarchy of accomplices. The son Afonso, who had returned from Portugal with liberal ideas on the lips and tyrannical practices in actions. The Geronimo, whose brutality was rewarded with privileges and whose pleasure in inflicting pain was evident in the smile he displayed during the punishments. Father Anselmo, who visited the ingenuity regularly to minister the sacraments and who, in his sermons, justified slavery as divine purpose as he closed his eyes to the witnessing horrors. Baron's youngest daughter, Donna Mariana, just 16, already showed the refined cruelty she learns. It was with the mother, using pins to stick their mucams when they did not get their hair hard, or sending them to their knees for hours as punishment for insignificant failures. The event that served as a final catalyst for Joachim's plan occurred 2 weeks after the death of Maria do Rosario. A ship arrived in Salvador bringing a special order to the Baron, a new instrument of torture called Angel, a kind of garrote used to slowly crush the thumbs and could make the victim crippled permanently. That same night, the Baron summoned all the enslaved for a public demonstration of the new device. The chosen victim was Antonio, an old man who worked in the sugarcane fields and whose crime had been slowing down due to his advanced age. Joaquim was forced not only to witness but to participate, holding a torch that illuminated the patio so that everyone could clearly see the face of the pain of the old Antonio, while the Baron personally turned the mechanism that crushed his fingers. "May this serve as a lesson," the Baron announced at the end of the demonstration. The old Antonio passed out at his feet. Santana Mill does not tolerate laziness, neither insubordination, nor the bad example. Her eyes traveled the semicircle of black faces, holding out for a longer moment in Joaquim. "Especially those in whom we place confidence," he added with a cold smile. At that moment, Joaquim learned that the Baron suspected something. Perhaps not the plan that was beginning to form in his mind, but of some subtle change in his behavior since his sister's death. It was the sign I needed. The time to act was running out. The demonstration of the Angel was not just another atrocity in the Santana Ingenio horrors catalog, it was the point of no return to Joaquim. The thin line that still kept him connected to his subjugated humanity was completely broken that night. It was in the first week of Lent that Joaquim's plan faced his most severe test. The Baron, pleased with the results of the Angel demonstration, decided it was time to reaffirm his authority over domestic, which he considered excessively privileged, and, therefore, potentially insubordinate. After Sunday lunch, he announced that there would be an inspection in the domestic senzala. All were aligned in the courtyard, while Flor Geronimo, accompanied by 2 captains of Mato, searched his meager belongings in search of forbidden objects, amulets, herbs, anything that could be associated with African religions or escape plans or rebellion. In Joaquim's treadmill, they found Maria do Rosario's strand of hair, carefully wrapped in the white cloth. The Baron, called to evaluate the discovery, examined the small package with contempt. "Who is this hair, Joaquim?" he asked, his falsely casual voice. Joaquim kept his eyes low. "From my sister, sir, who died recently." "Oh yes, the Mukama who died of fever." The Baron changed a significant look with his son Afonso. "Curious that you have kept a memory of it. It shows a sentimentality that I don't appreciate in my slaves." Then he turned to the gifts, lifting the small package. "See everyone, this is how disobedience begins. First they cling to each other more than their masters, then they keep objects of witchcraft, and finally, they plot against those who give them bread and the ceiling." With a sudden gesture, he threw the strand of hair into the brazier that burned in the center of the courtyard. Joaquim felt the blow as physical, but kept his face impassive, his eyes fixed on the fire that consumed his sister's last material memory. 50 whipping, ordered the Baron. "Here, so that everyone will see the price of insubordination." Tied to the trunk erected in the center of the courtyard, Joaquim endured every blow of the whip without emitting a single sound. His eyes remained open, fixed at one point beyond the trees, as if he could see something no one else saw. Blood dripped down his back, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating, adjusting, deciding. When the 15 blow was discharged, the Baron approached. "I hope you learned your lesson," he said, leaning out to see Joaquim's face. "You are still useful to me, and it would be a penalty to waste the training you received." Joaquim looked up then, finding the Baron's gaze for the first time in every year of service. What the Mill of Mill has seen in those eyes made him back a step, an expression of momentary confusion crossing his face. It was not hate what it saw. It was much colder, much more calculated. A decision already made. At that moment, without any word being said, the sentence was rendered, and the Baron, for a brief moment, felt the chill of those who have just crossed with his own executioner without recognizing him. Passed to humble publication, Joaquim began the preparations for his revenge with the meticulousness that characterized everything he did. First, I needed accomplices, not many, just enough and reliable enough to ensure the success of the operation. His first choice was Teresa, an elderly slave who worked in the kitchen of Casa Grande and who had lost 3 children to the cruelty of the mill. His knowledge of herbs and poisons would complement those Joaquim had learned from Father Adam. In addition, her advanced age and fragile appearance made her above any suspicion. The second accomplice was Sebastião, a strong young man who worked on the stables and had access to outside areas of property at night when he took care of the animals. Its function would be to ensure an escape route after the plan is executed. Finally, he recruited Antonia, one of Berenice's mucamas, who had access to the rooms and could provide information about the family's intimate routine, as well as helping to distract attention at the crucial moment. For each of them, Joaquim revealed only the part of the plan they needed to know. None of them knew exactly what would happen, only their specific functions. A precaution to any case was captured and forced to confess. The following weeks were devoted to the meticulous mapping of Casa Grande and its surroundings. Joaquim already knew the building well, but now he watched with new eyes, calculating distances, memorizing which floor tablets ranged, which doors needed oil in the hinges, which windows offered direct vision to the ladies' quarters. With Teresa's help, Joaquim began preparing the poison. The choice fell on a combination of plants: the Brazilian cassava, whose concentrated juice contains cyanidic acid, the obum, whose ground seeds cause internal bleeding, and tingui, used by the indigenous to stun fish, which in larger doses paralyzes the respiratory system. Preparation required extreme care. For 3 consecutive nights, Teresa and Joaquim worked in a small clearing in the woods, away from the eyes of the big house, boiling, filtering, and concentrating the liquid until they obtain a viscous and almost transparent substance that could be easily mixed with wine without significantly altering its taste. The container chosen to store the poison was a small glass bottle that Joaquim surveyed from the makeshift lab that Baron kept for experiments with different sugar qualities. The bottle was carefully hidden in a hole dug under the treadmill where Joaquim slept. The date chosen for the execution of the plan was the Easter Supper, April 20th, 1783. The choice was not random. Easter was one of the rare occasions when the whole family would be gathered, along with important guests from the region. Moreover, symbolism did not escape Joaquim. The celebration of the resurrection would become the scene of death to those who had distributed it so much. In the days preceding the chosen date, Joaquim was exceptionally dedicated and efficient. He personally supervised the cleanliness of the special silver that was only used on large occasions, polished the crystals until they shone like diamonds, and verified 3 times the wine stock to ensure that the best bottles were available for the celebration. His apparent submission after the public punishment pleased the Baron, who commented to the worker, "See, that's how a slave was tamed. 50 whip and he returned to his place." Little did he know that every servile of Joaquim was now hiding a very different purpose from submission. On the eve of Easter, the Santana Engenho became a scenario of acute contrasts. In Casa Grande, a bustle took over all the rooms as they prepared to receive the Baron's guests. Other planters, authorities of the nearby village, the bishop who would come especially from Salvador to celebrate Easter Mass in the Engenho chapel. Curtains were changed, polished furniture, fresh flowers arranged in arrangements made in the main rooms. In the kitchen, since dawn, slaves worked restlessly preparing the banquet. Roasted piglets, stuffed turkeys, candy, jams, Pascal motifs decorated cakes. Joaquim supervised the preparations for the cellar and dining room, his face a servile efficiency mask, while internally passed on every detail of the plane. Under his direction, the large rosewood table was extended to accommodate 20 guests, being covered with the best embroidered white linen towel that the family had. Meanwhile, at the back of the property, away from the eyes of the big house, a very different scene unfolded. Sebastião discreetly verified the horses that would be used in the escape, slightly loosening the ties of 3 animals chosen by their resistance and speed. Antonia, taking advantage of the confusion of preparations, had hidden small bundles with provisions at strategic points of the path that led to the woods. Teresa, in the kitchen, worked with the other slaves, but her look occasionally crossed with Joaquim's when she came to check some detail of the service. No word was exchanged beyond the strictly necessary, but an invisible tension pulsed among the conspirators, the awareness of what was about to happen. As the sun was beginning to put, the first guests arrived. Elegant carriages stopped at the staircase of Casa Grande, disembarking gentlemen in formal costumes and ladies in luxurious dresses. Joaquim received them at the door, gathering hats and canes, leading them to the main hall where the Baron and Baroness waited. In the senzala, an unusual silence prevailed. The enslaved who were not directly involved in the service of the feast remained quiet, many of them in prayers, some to the Christian God who had been imposed on them, others to the orishas and ancestors who were secretly worshipped. A palpable tension hovered in the air, as if something in the atmosphere itself announced that that night would not be like the others. The chapel bell sounded, calling everyone to Easter Mass. The guests left the big house in procession, following the bishop who carried a golden crucifix. Behind them, at a respectful distance, they followed domestic slaves, including Joaquim, who momentarily abandoned their preparations in the dining room to fulfill the religious obligation. During the ceremony, while the bishop spoke about resurrection and eternal life, Joaquim kept his eyes low, his hands united in apparent devotion, but his spirit was not there. He traveled between the memories of his violent sister, the old Antonio with crushed fingers, the countless lives broken to support the luxury that surrounded him. At the end of the Mass, while the gentlemen exchanged votes for Pascal happiness and the ladies commented on the new dresses from each other, Joaquim quickly returned to the big house. Taking advantage of the moment when everyone was still in the chapel or around, he headed for the room he shared with other domestic slaves, recovered the poison bottle of his hiding place, and hid it in an inner pocket sewn especially in his garment. On the big pendulum clock of the main hall, the hands approached 8 o'clock, the moment scheduled for the beginning of the supper. The guests returned from the chapel in small groups, talking excitedly. The Baron in particular seemed pleased, walking among his peers with the pride of those who display not only his material wealth, but also his power over human lives, the same slaves who now served drinks and appetizers with carefully neutral expressions. Tonight, Joaquim thought as he watched the scene from his post near the cellar, the balance will be restored. The execution of Joaquim's plan was a timed accuracy exercise. At 8:30, the guests were called to take their places at the table. The Baron occupied the headboard, with the Baroness on his right and the bishop on the left. The others were distributed according to their relative importance, with their son Afonso near the father and the young Mariana between two wives of authorities. The first part of the supper has passed without incidents. Joaquim and 3 other domestic slaves served the dishes prepared in the kitchen, moving silently around the table, attentive to empty glasses and dishes that needed to be removed. Teresa supervised the food flow that came out of the kitchen, ensuring that everything was perfect and, most importantly, that no one interfere with the meticulously prepared plan. When the time has been time to serve the pastel lamb, the supper's main course, Joaquim gave the combined sign with Antonia, which immediately knocked down a tray of cutlery near the door of the dining room. The crash attracted all the eyes, creating the distraction necessary for Joaquim to lean to the Baron to serve wine, discreetly dumped part of the bottle content in the crystal decanter that contained the special red wine reserved for the table headboard. Forgiveness for the incident, the Baron told the guests with a condescending smile. It's hard to find good servants these days, even when using methods. Persuasive. Educated laughs followed the comment, while Antonia hurriedly collected the fallen cutlery, pretending to be embarrassed. Joaquim, resuming his position near the auxiliary table where the drinks were, observed with clinical attention when the Baron raised his cup to propose a toast. "The risen Christ, and to the prosperity he gives us," declared the Lord of Ingenho, his voice carrying the arrogance of those who never questioned his right to the power he had. "To the risen Christ," the guests responded in unison, all guiding your cups. The Baron was the first to drink, followed by his son Afonso, who shared the same decanter. The Baroness, who preferred white wine, and Mariana, still very young to drink more than a few sips, were spared. The other guests drank from other bottles served by other slaves. Joaquim watched with clinical attention as the Baron emptied his cup, then returned to the animated conversation. The poison prepared by Teresa did not play instantly. This was part of the subtlety of the plan. It would take between 15 and 20 minutes for the first symptoms to manifest, long enough for any connection to the wine to be difficult to establish. The supper continued. The lamb was served and praised. New rounds of wine filled the cups. The conversation buzz filled the room while Joachim circulated, attentive to every detail, his face a perfect mask of servitude. It was during dessert, an elaborate pudding decorated with Pascal motifs, that the Baron took his throat for the first time, an expression of slight discomfort crossing his face. Beside him, Afonso already had an unusual pallor, although he tried to disguise, continuing to talk to the lady on her right. "Are you feeling well, my dear?" the bishop asked, noting the change in the host countenance. "Just a slight discomfort," said the Baron, forcing a smile. "Nothing that harms our celebration." But discomfort has quickly turned into something more serious. Minutes later, the Baron stood abruptly, knocking his chair, both hands tightening his chest. Her face, once stained by wine and satisfaction, now showed a cadaverous pallor, bluish veins standing out under the skin. "I can't breathe," arched before falling to the knees. Alfonso tried to get up to help his father, but his own legs weakened. His eyes, injected with blood, traveled the panicked hall until they landed on Joachim, which remained impassive near the door. For a brief moment his eyes met, and in the eye of the cope, Afonso saw not the fear or submission he expected, but a cold certainty, a relentless justice that finally reached him. Chaos took over the dining room. Ladies shouted. Gentlemen tried uselessly to help the two men who now writhing on the floor. Bishop knelt to manage the extreme utterance to the Baron, whose skin acquired a bluish tone while reddish foam sprouted from his lips. "Doctor, call a doctor," he shouted the Baroness, his face a mask of horror and misunderstanding. But there was no doctor in the mill, and the nearest was hours away. The Baron and his son agonized for more 20 minutes, his bodies shaken by violent seizures, until finally death complained them. The last sound emitted by the Baron was a deep sturt, followed by a silence that weighed on the room as a final sentence. Amid the confusion, no one noticed when Joachim fell discreetly until he disappeared through the back door. In the kitchen, he found Teresa, who nodded silently. Part of the plan was completed. Without changing a word, both went to the combined meeting point where Sebastian waited with the prepared horses. The fire began at the back of the main senzala, small at first, but powered by dry straw and whale oil, soon became a flame curtain that rose against the night sky. It was not a fire designed to kill. Joachim had guaranteed that the senzala was empty, with the slaves already gathered at a safe point on the edge of the woods, but to create chaos and confusion, covering the escape of the conspirators and those who wanted to follow them. In light of the flames, Joachim led a quick and solemn ceremony. In a circle formed by the enslaved who opted for the escape, about 30 men, women, and children, deposited in the center a small bunch of land over which the Baron had used, recovered in the riot, and beside her, Maria do Rosario's strand of hair that could save before being completely consumed by fire. "Death was served in this cup," said Joachim, his firm and clear voice, without further need to disguise his intelligence or authority. "Not for blind revenge, but for justice necessary. What we did today does not erase yesterday's suffering, but paves the way for a tomorrow where we can breathe as people, not as properties." He then raised the cup, still stained with remnants of poisoned wine, and poured its content on the earth. "May the earth drink the poison and turn it into strength to our journey. May those who departed before us guide our steps. May freedom once proven will never be denied." One of the elders of the group approached then, carrying a torch. To Joachim's sign, he set fire to the cup and the strand of hair, creating a small fog ritual wera. Each present passed through her, jumping over the flames in a symbolic gesture of purification and rebirth. When the latter had completed the ritual, Joachim pointed north. 3 days of march in that direction, a Quilombo where we will be received. They take only the necessary, move in silence, leave as little trail as possible. Teresa, Sebastião and I will be the last to ensure that no one is behind. Thus, while in the big house panic and confusion reigned, with bodies being prepared in hurry and messengers sent to seek help from the village, a silent column of newly liberated men and women moved as shadows through the forest, moving away from the flames that consumed the symbol of their oppression. At dawn, when Joachim finally took one last look back, he saw only a column of black smoke where the great house of the Santana was proud before. The smoke climbed a spiral, dissipating in the clear sky of Easter morning, a suitable requiem for the end of one era and the uncertain beginning of another. The news of what happened in the Santana and Genjo on Easter night 1783 spread like fire in dry straw throughout the Bahia and Reconcavo, and soon reached Salvador and other captaincies. Official reports recorded in correspondence between colonial authorities described what happened as a slave riot led by a perfidious black who, abusing their master's confidence, poisoned them during the Holy Easter Supper, burned down and fled more than 30 pieces. The governor of Bahia, alarmed with the implications of the event, sent an urgent letter to the viceroy in Rio de Janeiro, warning of what he called new and terrible rebellion method that, if imitated, can compromise all the security of the colony. He asked for military reinforcements and authorization to employ the most severe methods of repression in order to prevent such an example from spreading. The answer was not long. Military detachments were sent to all main mills in the region, with express orders to increase surveillance and exemplarily punish any sign of insubordination. Rewards were offered by the capture of Joaquim and his main accomplices, with posters describing them posted in churches and public places. But the effect was the opposite of the desired. The story of the cope who poisoned his masters did not only circulate among the authorities, but also, and especially, among the enslaved. From senzala to senzala in night whispers, the story was told and retold, often with additions and elaborations that made it even more dramatic. The Joaquim method, as it became known, inspired similar actions on other mills, though rarely with the same success. In June of that same year, 3 domestic slaves were hanged in Salvador's public square, accused of trying to poison his lord's family. In September, a cook was burned alive in Pernambuco for a similar crime. These brutal retaliation, however, failed to contain what had become a powerful symbol of resistance. Fear settled in the large houses of the whole colony. Gentlemen who once ate and drank carelessly, now they examined with suspicion each plate, each glass. Some have reached the extreme of forcing slaves to prove the food before themselves, reliving a medieval practice of poisoning protection. In an anonymous report found in the archives of the Inquisition, a priest described the climate that settled. There is a fear that never before. The planters, who previously ruled with iron hand, now sleep with an open eye, fearing that their own servants, those who prepare their food and serve their wine, whether they have their places in potential, contaminated not only the wine of that fatal supper, but the very relationship between lords and slaves. The effect of the Joaquim method was so deep that in some regions, physical punishments have temporarily decreased, not for humanity, but for fear of similar retaliation. A system supported by terror began to experience the bitter taste of fear itself. What had begun as a personal revenge had become a symbol, and symbols have power far beyond its creators. Joaquim, without pretending, had become an almost mythical figure in the accounts that now ran from mouth to mouth, growing and becoming with each new narration. The hunt for Joaquim and his followers mobilized considerable resources from the colonial government. Regular troops and Mato captains searched forests, investigated known quilombos, and questioned, often under torture, anyone suspected of having information about the whereabouts of fugitives. For almost 3 months, no concrete trail has been found. It was as if the earth had swallowed Joaquim and his U.S. companions. Some said they had managed to reach the Great Quilombo of the Palmares, others who had taken refuge in indigenous villages in the unexplored interior. There were even those who claimed that Joaquim had managed to board a ship in the port of Salvador, fleeing to the Antilles or even to Africa. The truth, when it finally came to light, was more prosaic, and at the same time more dramatic than the legends that were already beginning to form. In October 1783, a patrol led by Captain Rodrigo Mendes located the group of fugitives in a mountainous area about 80 leagues from the Santana and Genjo, where they had established a small quilombo in a natural cave, well camouflaged by dense vegetation. The confrontation was brutal and unequal. The soldiers, armed with muskets and swords, surrounded the camp at dawn. The quilombolas, although they had built some rudimentary defenses and had some weapons, machetes, arches, and only 2 firearms obtained in travelers, were rapidly surrounded by upper number and armament. Many were still killed in the first moments of the attack. Others, including women and children, were captured alive. Only a small group, led by Joachim, managed to break the siege and flee into the woods. The chase lasted 2 days. One by one, the fugitives were reached and slaughtered or captured. Teresa was the first to fall, her elderly body not resisting the rhythm of the escape. He preferred to face the chasers with a makeshift dagger to surrender, and was shot dead. Sebastian was captured alive while trying to protect 2 children who could not follow the rhythm of the escape. Taken back to the main camp, he was subjected to torture to reveal the whereabouts of Joachim, but remained silent to the end, eventually being performed by hanging on a nearby tree. Joachim, accompanied only by Antonia and 2 other men, managed to maintain distance from the persecutors for another day, until they were cornered on the edge of a steep gorge. With his way ahead blocked by the abyss and the soldiers quickly approaching behind, Joachim made his final decision. Turning to his companions, he said words that would later be repeated many times, in many different versions, but whose essence remained consistent in the reports. They can capture our bodies, but not our souls. They can tell our story like that of criminals, but we know we are justice. Then, instead of surrendering or fighting in a lost battle, Joachim and his last companions made the only choice left to them. They jumped together to the abyss, preferring death and freedom to recapture and torture that would certainly follow. Captain Rodrigo Mendez, in his official report, coldly described the event. Negro Joachim, the main head of the Santana mill, along with 3 accomplices, voluntarily fired a cliff when surrounded by our troops, thus demonstrating the savagery and lack of fear typical of his race. Their bodies could not be recovered due to the spawned nature and animal-present savages in the area. What the official report did not mention was what witnesses would later relate, that Joachim, before jumping, turned to his persecutors one last time and, with a serene smile that disconcerted even the most experienced soldiers, raised a small empty bottle identical to what had contained the poison used in Easter supper, as in a last, challenging gift. His last words, heard only by the nearest soldiers, were simple and direct. The poison remains. After almost 2.5 centuries since the events in the Santana Ingenio, the history of Joachim continues to reverberate, albeit in different and often contradictory ways. For the official history, recorded in the books and documents of the time, he is just a footnote, another example of brutally suppressed slave rebellion in a colony that saw hundreds of similar cases. But in oral tradition, especially in the descendant communities of enslaved in the Bahia and Recôncavo, Joachim transcended the simple condition of historical character to become an almost mythical figure, a symbol of cunning resistance against seemingly invincible oppression. In the Capoeira wheels, its name occasionally appears in songs that celebrate those who faced the slave system. In some candomblé toreros, especially those with strong resistance traditions, some light candles to Joachim on specific dates, treating him as a powerful ancestor who opened ways through cunning and determination. The story of the copero who poisoned his masters was transmitted orally for generations, assuming variations and additions that reflect the hopes and fears of the communities that preserved it. In some versions, Joachim did not die by jumping from the cliff, but managed to escape and lived for many years in freedom, sharing his knowledge with other quilombolas. In others, his spirit remains guardian of the oppressed, ready to inspire acts of resistance when injustice becomes unbearable. Objects related to their history also gained special meaning. In a small community museum in the region where the Santana Ingenio was, there is a crystal bowl that, according to the local tradition, would be the same used by the Baron in the fateful supper. The authenticity of the object is questionable, but its symbolic power is undeniable. Visitors leave small offerings with it, especially herbs and white flowers. In rural areas near the place where Joachim and his companions are believed to have made their last leap, residents report listening, in certain nights of full moon, the sound of voices singing softly, and the tin of cups in a ghostly toast. The Academy only recently began to devote more serious attention to the figure of Joachim, recognizing him not only as the author of an act of rebellion, but as a sophisticated strategist who understood and explored the weaknesses of the system that oppressed him. Modern historians debate about the political and social implications of their action, some arguing that cases such as his contributed to accelerate the process of questioning slavery in Brazil, While academics discuss dates and documents, seeking to separate fact from fiction, in communities that kept their memory alive, the distinction is less important. There, Joachim is remembered not so much for the factual details of his life, but for the meaning of his actions, a man who refused to accept dehumanization, who turned his position of servitude into a platform for an act of justice, who chose death in freedom rather than captivity life. Perhaps the greatest testimony of its lasting impact is the fact that, more than 2 centuries later, its history is still able to cause reflections on power, resistance, and the high price of freedom. In a country that often tries to forget or soften the brutalities of his colonial and slave past, Joachim's memory remains an uncomfortable and necessary reminder. Today, when the last sun's rays bathe the ruins of what was the Santana Ingenio, some say that if you pay attention, you can hear the soft tilint of crystals touching a silent toast, echoing through the centuries, celebrating not only a consummate revenge, but a freedom achieved at a terrible but necessary price. As the poisoned cup that sealed the fate of the Baron and his son, the story of Joachim is still served from generation in generation, a powerful reminder that even in the oppressive systems, the seed of resistance finds fertile soil to germinate. If you watch so far, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Joachim's story touched her heart. Share so that Joachim's memory will never be forgotten.